series, and I don't think the title necessarily speaks fully to what the series is about, but it's called Hearing and Responding to God's Voice. And I picked it because I think it's interesting when we talk about, well, did you hear the voice of God, or can you speak to that? I'm sorry, I forgot to silence my phone. What does that voice sound like? How do we know, what that voice sounds like? And so I think we always think, well, it's got to be this audible voice, or this, call to ministry. It's this, this profound thing that asks you to do something different. But really what we want to look at is that how God speaks through all humanity at all times in all places. And what that sounds like and what that will feel like to people at different points, it depends upon what the calling is. And really, it's just recognizing that God indeed has a special voice, a special calling for each person. And so we want to look at these, and I hate to call them characters, because I don't know, for me, when I call these biblical characters, it sounds like they're not real. But these historic figures in our biblical faith tradition, looking at their lives, who they were, and as importantly, who they were not. Because I think we always elevate these people as they just never had a doubt, a question, in the world, and they were some that really, really special person that God, was only them that could do this work. But I think there were very ordinary people, and I think we forget that. And so we're going to look at 6 different people throughout the course of this study. So the thing that I sent you, let's see if I can get this to come up here. The thing that I sent you, for your schedule, you'll have to bump everything a week differently than what it's currently set for. But we're going to be looking at various people's calling. And so as we move into talking about, well, how is it that we understand our calling? I think one of the things that we want to always speak to is that, our callings are all different, and they're going to be shaped at many times through life with multiple callings. And so if I may use myself as a personal example, I was, and I realize now how fortunate, because it's not always the case, that from an early age, I just felt that I wanted to teach. It was always a part of me. It was the thing I played as a child. It was, everything about me was about this calling, to just teach. It was just placed on me. And yet later in life would come this calling to enter ministry, this calling to answer God's specific call to enter into ministry. But that calling is no different than the very callings that you all have had in your life, where you have felt led to do something. And it may change throughout our lifetime. I think people have the calling to become a parent. People have a calling to long for a marital partner, and so forth. And so, it's multiple callings. And some callings come because we have been planted with a skill that we just follow through with that. We can kind of see how things work and what we're supposed to be. So I come back to, my calling to be a teacher. Other people, may feel called to enter engineering, such as my husband. And, and what I find in people sometimes is they miss that. They want to know, well, what is my skill set? What really can I do? And they don't really, have trouble sometimes deciphering that out. But sometimes our calling also comes because there's this deep, undesirable desire that we have that we just can't ignore. And I must say that was my calling to ministry. I never felt like I had the skills necessarily for ministry, but I just felt this calling was something I could not overlook, even though I tried to, and made no sense to me in the scope of the world that this would be a calling. The author of the text that I'm using sort of as an outline for this series mentions that movie Chariots of Fire, where the person in that, feels this call to run. He said, I just can't come past this. And so I've got this call to run. So yes, he had a calling in other areas too, but it was just this deep, undeniable desire that led him to what the calling was. But at the end of the day, all of us who call ourselves Christians have a calling. It doesn't matter if we're laity, if we're clergy, it doesn't matter. If we call ourselves Christian, we have a calling. And the calling is defined very simply as we are to be the people who follow Christ's teachings and to serve his disciples. We have this calling that we must do what Christ asked us to do, and we must also have this servant's heart. And there's where we come up with that mandate that Jesus gave us. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. So just to pause there for just half a second. When we look at that calling, that authority that Jesus imbues each of us with, I think sometimes we get real hung up on go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them. But we don't do the second part, where we get caught up, particularly in some faith traditions, with did you accept and are you baptized? And I've heard that even in the last week, someone being asked, well, when was your believer's baptism? Which was their way to discount infant baptism. But we get hung up there. But the part that we don't pick up on and the part that we don't follow through with is, well, what does that look like? And Jesus was very clear, teach them to obey everything that I have commanded you to do. Jesus was not as worked up about us being baptized and about accepting him as he was about us following him. Everything about Jesus' life was about following him. So if you will allow me, I don't mean to be political and I don't mean to bring up bad things, but whenever I look at the Capitol and not making any other judgments upon people or having no judgment at all, really, about their Christianity or their faith. But to me, if any action you take is not congruent with what Jesus would have been doing, then we're not following through with our discipleship call. So it gives each of us a standard by which we judge our own words, our own actions, and our own behaviors. So if I can't imagine Jesus saying some of these things, then I don't think they should be said. If I can't imagine Jesus, doing some action, then the action doesn't need to be done. Because I think when I hear this phrase, about, following Jesus, he never said, and if I can back up and take the thief on the cross as an example, when the thief acknowledged that Jesus was the Son of God, and it's to him that we should follow, he was saved in that very moment, wasn't he? Because Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. He never said, get off this cross, go be baptized, go take a new member class, read the Bible and take discipleship, and then come back and report to me how you've done. The man grasped very early that following Jesus was the way. And so when we speak of eternal life, it's not about punching a ticket of baptism and acceptance. It's about following what Jesus was. And I think that that's the ultimate message of all of our calling, is that's what we're called to do. We're called, one, that we follow Jesus, and two, we serve others in the same capacity that Jesus did. So in that same Matthew book is that story of, when did we see you thirsty, hungry, naked? And Jesus replies, when you've seen one of these and helped them, you've helped me. So it's that following action that he is always speaking of. So questions, comments on that? I sort of went off on a little sermonette there. So does that make sense?
When you said that about baptism, that God didn't talk much about that. But in reading this today, it seemed like circumcision was very big then. I don't see why that was so important. I just don't see.
Yeah. Well, between you and I, Mary, I've struggled with that too. And I do sometimes wonder of all the things God could have chosen as an act of solidarity. Why that? I do know that a part of it, because we're in a more tribal kind of society, that there were markings that showed people what your allegiance was to, and and why that particular one. I wish I could explain it. I can't. And I've had some really weird thoughts about that, like how one knew that one was circumcised and one wasn't. I don't even want to go there. But I also wonder about taking foreskins as rewards from battle too. So it's just and on behalf of every man watching now, I'm going with you. So I don't know. I don't know why he chose circumcision as an act of solidarity, but that's what it was. It was the same thing that I often say that a football team, when they want to show that they're all together, they'll all go cut their hair in the same way. They'll all get the mohawk, or why in the armed services, you all get the tattoo that says about that. It was a way to show solidarity as much as anything. But why that particular way? I don't. That's a good question. Yeah. But apparently, wasn't that important later, because as we learned in the New Testament, you didn't have to do that really. In which case, all men prior to them went, seriously. So,
Start.
but so I think, and the reason I want to emphasize this thing about following Jesus is because until we get that in our head, that my primary goal as a Christian is to follow Jesus, then I don't know what voice to listen to. Because what we're asking then is that everything that we do do we think that this is in keeping with Jesus? So to expand on that just a tiny bit more, a lot of people want to know, what's God's plan for me? Well, I'll give it to you. God's plan is that you follow Jesus. It's not, when we say that, we're wanting insight. Is this the person I should marry? Is this the job that I should take? Is this the town that I should move to? All those, that's what we think of as a plan, isn't it? That's a world plan. When should I retire? Should I have a child? We go through all these kind of things. God's ultimate plan is just this. Will you follow Jesus? It comes down to that. And so when I'm picking a mate, if I'm deciding, where I'm going to live, or what job I'm going to take, or anything about those decisions, in contrast with where I think God is calling me, what he's asking me to do. Is this job going to maybe diminish my relationships with others, diminish my relationship with God? Then I've got to question that. Is this partner that I'm choosing to be with, are they someone with whom I could be equally yoked in my faith? Am I able to care for a child in a loving, responsible way that God would ask me to do that? See, those are the questions. God is not going to come to you, and he doesn't have this little blueprint that says, all right, Glenna, at this age, you're going to go to this school and you're going to get this degree and you're going to take this job. It's not all laid out nice and neat. What God is ultimately concerned about is, are we following Jesus? And Jesus told us how to follow him. He says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the two greatest commandments. He said, this is the kind of the benchmark by which you can measure everything. So I come back to the unrest. It's not just been at the Capitol, but throughout the country for whatever reason. And those are the questions, I'm asking, are we loving God in our actions? And above all, are we loving one another? And unfortunately, the answer is no. We're not, so I don't care whatever ground that we stand on. If we can't love others through the process, then we're not following Christ. And I think that's why MLK Day is just so incredible to me, the knowledge and the sense, if you will, that MLK exhibited when our natural response to violence is violence, and he took an alternative path because that's what Jesus would have done. And so I think we've got to kind of come back to that. And so our calling, our initial calling, our only real calling is that we be obedient to be what it is that Jesus calls us to be. So that means then that in some ways, everybody's calling is going to look a little bit different because we're all different. And so, but we're uniquely gifted and uniquely created to live out our calling in specific ways. Is where in this world is God equipping us to go forth and to command others and to teach others by our light, if you will, the way of Jesus. And so we're all not going to end up in the same place. We're all going to feel very passionate about different things. We're all going to speak to different things. And that's okay. And the other part is that our calling will evolve over a lifetime. We'll find multiple places that we live out our calling, multiple communities where we'll live out our calling. I know many of you are retired and you're in different communities than you were when you were in the workplace, but you still have a gathering and a community of people in which you're called to go forth and to live out the calling of Jesus. And for those of us in the life of the church, we realize that our calling, we just don't get to come sit in the pew every week and listen to the sermon. Our calling is outside those walls. What does that look like? What does that, feel like? And, we pick specific mission endeavors or discipleship endeavors or caring endeavors, service endeavors in which we go and we live that out, over our lifetime. Because ultimately, this is the thing, is no matter how skilled or unskilled that we are, or how worthy or unworthy we may feel, God will help us to fulfill that purpose. And like I said, I just speak from personal experience. No one wrestled with feeling unworthy about entering the call to ministry. I won't say no one, I don't know everyone, but I fully grasped that unworthiness call to fill God's purposes in serving in ministry. And in my lifetime in ministry, I've discovered that everyone feels that too. For the most part, if you feel worthy of God's call, then you're probably not. But that God will use us for that. And so we can't really use the excuse, I don't have the skill set for that, or I'm unworthy to do that. Because what we're going to see in these 6 biblical historical figures in the Bible is that every one of them felt that way, but God proves to us how he can work through even our biggest shortcomings in order to do his work. And so what we'll learn as we look at these 6 people is in their stories of faith that one, God did not call perfect people. They're meant to be stories of encouragement with which we can, see what they faced and how they overcame it. But lastly, they're to be stories of connection. What about these people can we find some common ground, some commonality in, and see that we share that same characteristic? One thing that is abundantly clear in any historical study is that, places change, cultures change, fashions change, all of that does. But you know what? Human nature seems to stay the same from one generation to the next to the next. That the very things that were tripping people up thousands of years ago, greed, envy, power, all those things trip us up today. And so, we're still the same character of people as that in which God originally created. And so these are the studies. These are the 6 that we're going to do. Today we're doing Abraham. Then we want to look at Hannah, and then Esther, Jonah, and then we want to look at the disciples, the followers of Jesus, not particularly the 12 disciples. And then we do want to look at the beloved disciple as told in the story of John. And we want to look at, well, what was their story then? How does it compare to our story now? And what characteristics do we see of ourselves, of those people then, and the people that we now have become? And so the story that we're going to be looking at today is in the story of Genesis. I would love to spend a study doing Genesis. It takes about 12 weeks though, too, because it is a jam-packed book. It's one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. And it's divided basically into two parts. It has what we call primeval history, which is chapters 1 through 11. And in that, we've got the creation story, we've got the story of Noah, and we really see God giving creatively to the world everything that he's got. And we see man's bent, to quote the old song, bent towards sinning, that they just seem like they can't help themselves. They just can't stay on the right path. And then it moves to what we call patriarchal history, and that's the 12th through the 50th chapters. And so what we see are major figures in this period of time: Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, and ultimately Judah and Jacob's family. And within those, we have what we call a teledoth, which is their generational stories. So we have Abraham, and his will has the story of Isaac and Ishmael. We have Jacob, and his will be the story as of his sons. And then we have Joseph, and it'll be the stories of his descendants. And so those are the big headings, but we call these the patriarchs, these who laid the very foundation upon which we still stand in our history. The other really cool thing about this is that three huge faith religions, three of the dominant faith religions of the world, trace themselves back to these patriarchal stories. We have that in common. We have that commonality above it. So it's foundational not only to us, but also to Judaism and to the Islam faith. So when we look, well, how do we get from Noah to Abram? Because when we read our Bibles, it's almost like the story of Noah happened, in his descendants, and we flip the page to the beginning, the end of chapter 11, the beginning of chapter 12, and suddenly there's Abram and Terah and all of that. And so it's like, how do we get there? And if you take the moment to read, and it's boring to read, but we always, when we get into genealogical stories, we get kind of mired down in the words and so forth. But I want you to see how many generations there are. Abram will come from the line of Shem. And so to get from Shem, who is the son of Noah, one of the three sons of Noah, down to Abram, you see the lineage that it takes. And if you read those scriptures, it tells you these astronomical numbers. He lived another 450 years. He lived another 500 years. He lived another, and we won't even get into the conversation of how it was that they interpreted what a year was then, because Methuselah is encountered in this ancestry, and he lived to 900 and something years. And, we scratch our heads and wonder, it's really not the point of the story. The point of the story is the genealogy. And so you get down to Nahor, who had a son named Terah, and Terah had three sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, Haran would die, and he had a son named Lot. And so Lot was traditional in those families. His grandfather is Terah. And so Lot, the son of Haran, would be taken into that family lineage there. Eventually, Terah will die, and Abram is the uncle to Lot, and he will take over responsibility for Lot. So that's how Lot's story gets into the midst of this particular one. And of course, like us, when you have multiple names from generation to generation, it can get kind of confusing, such as in the case of Nahor. Nahor was Terah's dad, but Nahor was also his son, so it gets a little confusing with that. Now, what we know, about these people, if you will, is, and this is where we get their story. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. Terah took his son, Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Now the Chaldeans is another name, if you will, for the Babylonians, is where that particular story is. So when we want to look and see, well, where are we then in time and place? So I've given you this map, and this will be a part of your notes that I send out with you this afternoon with the video. So I like to see where I am when I'm looking at all this, because we think of these places as being ancient and far away. But if we consider ourselves around the Mediterranean Sea, we can all get a feeling for where that is. And even the boot of Italy is very easy to see there. And we put ourselves into Egypt, which is still Egypt in that particular part of the world. But what we have, do you see where the word Arabia is? This was all desert land, everything here. And so the green land that went up over into the mountains and around the desert was called the Fertile Crescent, because it looks like a crescent moon, if you will. And it was there that most life took place, because it had a source of water, it had some mountains, and these roads were really very developed for that period of time. So in Ur, which is over on this right-hand side of this map, is where our story begins, in the land of Ur. Now, at this time, the Akkadians, and you'll see the word Akkad there, there was a lot of movement among people, and they were much more sophisticated sometimes than we want to think that they were. But there was a road system, and people moved from place to place. They were nomadic people based upon water sources and wherever there were jobs and wherever there was work to do, just like today. So they were a migrant people. They moved from area to area. And some believe that the land of Ur had become very overworked, if you will, that there wasn't many opportunities there, which was part of the reason that Terah packed up his family. He was the patriarch of that family, and began moving toward the land of Canaan. So in essence, God calls Terah because he takes everybody with him. But on the way, you'll hear in scripture all these different places that they stop. But for some reason, they stop for an extended period of time in Haran, probably because it was fertile ground there, probably because they could kind of make a living there. But in the meantime, while they're living there, Terah dies. So now Lot is his responsibility. And so God calls upon him then the grand calling of Abram to go forward and to occupy this land of Canaan. And that's where our third circle is here. And really this whole land that runs along the Mediterranean is basically called the land of Canaan. Now, in the land of Canaan, there were Amorites and Moabites and Canaanites and all, but they do eventually travel, and they do end up there. Eventually, a famine would come upon this area, and he would leave and he would flee down to the land of Egypt for there. So that's kind of telling you where you are so that you can kind of get a picture of this in your head. Now, they think that he left, they think that the patriarchal history, if you will, meaning kind of the whole book of Genesis, would have ended, before the time of the Exodus. So when we come to the story of the Exodus, modern scholarship thinks that the Exodus happened about 1260 BCE. So if we back that up, they think that it was about 400 years before that this story of the patriarchs would have taken place, because some believe that, by that period of time that would have stopped, and we can kind of move into the Exodus story. So, but prior to that, like I said, I want us to understand that these areas were kind of divided into three different areas. They were divided into Mesopotamia, Egypt, and then into the Sumerian place. But when we come to Egypt, Egypt was in a time of great prosperity during this time. This is the period of time that they would have built the Great Pyramids. And I think we sometimes overlook, like, they had writing, they understood how to read. It was even more than hieroglyphics. There was the cuneiform writing, which was kind of the first writing style there was, but the people could read. There was some quite a bit of literacy in the area. And there was a great deal of work being done in the arts. So there was wisdom literature being produced, there were narrative tales being produced. And it's upon this that the whole historical narrative of God and God's being with his people began to take shape. So this is how the story will be told. This is how it would be proffered to the generations yet to come. And this is kind of where we kind of can put God in place and time. The story of Eden, you know, they think it's around the Euphrates River was the area of which that story has taken place, but a specific time period, a little bit harder to place that. And then, like I said, these were pastorally nomadic people. So they moved and so they traveled and they took with them pieces of every culture in which they lived, which meant they also took with them the religions of about every culture that they lived. Wherever they moved into, they just kind of adopted that religion, at the time, added that to their list of gods, if you will. And so one of the things when we read the text, and one of the things we kept hearing in our head over and over, is we cannot ever read the Bible as a history book because it doesn't work that way. The whole purpose of the Bible was about giving understanding to who God was. And so what we want to be more concerned with is not exactly all the details of the history in terms of the kings, the places, and the things that were going on, but what was the ultimate message of God that the people were supposed to be receiving at that time. So when we come to the religion of Abraham, like I said, people moved around. We know that he was basically a polytheist at the time, meaning he believed in many gods. And the only reason that we know that is it's recorded in the book of Joshua. And this is what it said. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abram and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshiped other gods." And so, and we need to see that and we need to hear that because when Abram hears this message from God, he is going to take every other religion and abandon it in order to follow this one God with a single-minded devotion. This is huge. This is a huge thing. And so when they say the Lord, the God of Israel, and you see that Lord is in all caps. And every time you see that, the people would not have even spoken this name. Yahweh was not what they spoke. And so, but it would speak to the fact that this was the Almighty God, the God so great that we dare not even, say his name. And so what we're seeing as we transition from this primeval history to this patriarchal history is that we're moving from a world stage, if you will, and that's the story of Noah, the world as they knew it, to this one single family. And out of this single family would become the seedbeds for what we now know as Christianity, what the Muslims know as Islam, and what the Jewish people know as Judaism. And what we're going to see is what began in these first 11 chapters is this downward spiral that started in the Garden of Eden. And then even after Noah, the righteous man, saved that portion of his family, and they were all kind of falling off the path once more time. Now the future of the family seems to rest in this man, Terah, and his son, Abram. And what we'll see in this, that even though everything seemed to be crumbling, God had not abandoned his creation. And though the generations to come then and still to come today will have trouble, he's still there. And this is the assurance, this is the theological understanding that the story of Abraham will teach us. And so in God's plan, he wants the creation, the world as he created it, to be reclaimed through the long ancestry of Abraham. And so when we say that Abraham's descendants are more numerous than the stars in the sky, we have to get in our heads around, we're not just talking about in Abraham's lifetime, we're talking about in everyone who would come to pass, that they would be the believers in this God and in this religion that this God set forth from the day of Abraham to the end of time. Now, in your, I asked you to read 25 chapters, or sorry, not 25 chapters, I asked you to read from chapter 11 or 12 through 25. And if we were to take these stories and to break them into column headings or what your Bible does and explain them. This is kind of how it flowed. We have the call of Abraham, then Abraham and Sarah are in Egypt. And that's that quick little story where Abraham was afraid that Sarah would be, was better to pass off as his sister than to pass off as his wife. Otherwise, they were going to run into trouble. We get the story of Abram and Lot dividing their ways. Both of their properties have become so big. One went one way and one went the other. The story of Abram and Melchizedek when they're arguing with the king over different things. We have God making his covenant once again with Abram. And then we have the story of Hagar and Sarah, where Sarah was growing impatient with this promise and offered Hagar as a substitute for herself. And we have the covenant and the introduction of that sign of the covenant of circumcision. Then we see the three strangers visit Abraham and Sarah, one of which was the Lord, and the great hospitality was shown to them, but also the place where Sarah laughs. And Isaac, if you didn't know what it means, son of laughter. Then we have the story of Abraham going to save Lot and trying to get the people of Sodom. Then we have the story of two conflicts with the king. But also we have that story of the testing of Abraham as he's offering Isaac as a sacrifice, Abraham buying land back in Canaan, and then the death of Abraham. So I just want to stop because I trust that you all have either heard those stories or reread those stories today. But I just want to spend just a moment or two just asking, of those stories, which one encourages you and which one makes you scratch your head?
I think the testing of Abraham to burn child is pretty gruesome.
Yeah. So what do you think is the ultimate meaning of that story?
God will do the right thing for you or suggest the right time.
It doesn't trouble any of you that Abram went to Egypt and gave his wife away, basically?
And he did that twice.
Yeah.
Oh, self-preservation.
Yeah.
Option comment.
You're going to give me away.
Never.
In our case, they just give me back. No thanks. So, thanks, but no thanks. So,
But Glenna, don't we have to consider the culture and the time that happened?
yeah, for sure.
I'm thinking it wasn't nice of Sarah to be mad at Hagar when she was the one that wanted her to get pregnant. And then when she got pregnant, she was mean to her and she had to leave. I thought that was not very nice.
Yeah, I'm with you. So, and then we have to, but don't just hold her responsible, because we also have to say, well, when she wanted her sent away, Abram didn't step up for her, did he? Like, well, no, this is my son. Can't just send him out into the woods, He kind of went along with that too. So.
Well, I think it had to do with the descendant.
Of course, I always felt sorry for Hagar too, because when she was told she'd have a child, that he would be an ass of a man. I'm like, this is not what mothers want to hear. So when your child is born, just like, really? Well, I think when we look at these stories on composite, I think what I always see in these stories, from the very beginning of, okay, they're following the Lord. They've gone into Canaan, they've lived there, now they're heading into Egypt. But when times got tough, Abram didn't trust him, did he? We're going into Egypt and I don't trust that you're going to be with me in this. So just to make sure that nothing's going to go haywire here, I'm going to intervene and just say, just take my wife, and save our skin, if you will, And then when I get to the story of Isaac, we see almost a different thing. He was trusting that God was going to do the right thing. So what I see in that is a growth, if you will, of Abraham kind of through time, which is a good lesson for us, isn't it? Because initially in life, maybe if you think back to things that you used to get upset about, particularly in your teens or early 20s, if we can even remember that far back, but how we didn't really have a lot of trust. We saw everything as, some kind of punishment or punitive, or, just weren't sure which way we ought to go or what we ought to do in the face of the civilization that we're living. So I see this growth in Abraham that, from those days of going into Egypt and not trusting that God was with them, to offering this most precious thing that he now had, his son, was a great step and a boldness of what trust was. But I've also, in my latter years, began to think of this story of Isaac being sacrificed as a sort of a way that God teaches us about priorities. I think when you've longed for children for a long time, we can kind of fall victim of they become our little idols, once they're finally there. And, and for them, Isaac was just like this long awaited, long promised, unexpected, son that was finally going to come to them. And when he did, can you imagine what a gift he would have seemed to them? And they probably would have bent over backwards to do everything for him because he's this long awaited. And maybe in some way they were thinking of Isaac more highly than they thought about the God who brought Isaac to them. And I think it's today in Bill Kilday's devotional, he tells a story about that, about, a pastor going to a house for a meal and of a farmer, and the pastor thanks the land, the animals, that he gives thanksgiving for everything. And the farmer says, well, what about me? I'm the one who did all this. And it's like he had forgotten that all that he had was because that God had blessed him with it. And so I'm wondering if that too is part of the story for Isaac, in that sacrificial place there. The other thing that I hope you figure out as you're reading about the covenant is that unlike the Mosaic covenant, where Moses will go to the mountaintop and he'll bring down this list, if you will, of things that God is asking the people to adhere to, the 10 commandments. In Abram's case, God is the one doing all the giving. I'm going to make you the owner of this land. I promise you descendants as numerous as the stars. I promise to be with you. And the only request that he asked of Abraham is that he remained faithful or righteous, stay right with me. Isn't that interesting? Between those two covenants, this first covenant, God is just pouring it all out. And it would not be until the Mosaic covenant, which is the promise, that we also now have a responsibility that we give back to God. And so that initial covenant was just like the covenant of Adam, and and now this same covenant, and with Noah, he's making the promises. He comes back, for Adam, he gives you this is what I promise you, this wonderful land, and Adam broke it. Noah, here's this, promise he's making to all the people. I'll never again do this. And he did it. But what did they do? They went on and sinned anyway. And so we're going to see this, change as we kind of move through here. But initially, God is the one who put everything out there. So any other comments on all of those different stories in Genesis? Well, I had you read all those because it is important that we see that, like I said, that there's growth in Abraham as he moves from Abram to Abraham through his story. And there's the lessons that I think that we learn, from him is that he's asking each family to live in such a way as to reflect God's light and love so that everyone will be drawn closer to God and begin to live once again as those created in the Lord of life's loving image. And so what God begins with, just as in the creation story, he didn't ask anything of us. He gave us everything. And he says, and so we, then we have to acknowledge that we are who we are, where we are, what we have, based upon God's grace upon us. And so our job, what God asks us to do, is to live righteous, right with him, and that we become his light and love as exhibited by Christ, in the world. And so when we say, well, it seems unimaginable to think that, Abram would, and Terah really would leave everything they knew, their culture, their land, everything, move to a new area. But then Abram would leave more behind. He would leave his religion, all of his practices, everything he did to follow this one. And so we say, well, was it blind faith then that he just kind of went forward? Well, really, no, it wasn't blind faith, because what Abram was able to do is to look back and see the faithfulness of God in the past. So the only requirement for him was simply to go. And it would be the words that Jesus mimicked when he said, go therefore and make disciples. So these connections of these covenant stories, come together here. I was with a friend one day and we were in a, seminar, and that's what the speaker was saying. He says that God just says go. He says the first two letters of God are go. And my colleague said, yeah, and the last one's duh. And so it is that, we are called to go and to make disciples. It was the call of Abraham. It's the call of Jesus upon us. But it is okay. And what the life of Abraham teaches us is that there's going to be some doubt, and we're going to need some reassurance. And that also is part of the journey that we take. That, there's going to be many times where we go and we look back and go, should I have done that or not? And I've often wondered when they landed in Canaan and then this famine hits, that if sometime did Abram not think, maybe I should have just stayed up in Haran, or we never should have left Ur. And so many times we spend so much time thinking, well, we shouldn't have, that maybe we can't see that we're still, as long as we're being obedient to God, that God is still there and that God is not going to leave us stranded. And we find that reason to trust because we need to always remember and look back and see, what has God already done? Where do we see God in our past? And if we can't see God in our past, we'll never see him in our future. We'll never see him in our present. And so we have to continue to remember what God has done, where God has been. And we see that in Abram over time, as he aged and as he had experiences over and over again, he saw the presence of God in the midst of the difficulties of life. So yes, Abraham exhibited some doubt. He, at times in his story, some insecurity and some impatience at times. He questioned and he complained, but God stayed faithful. God stayed faithful to the covenant that he'd made with Abraham, but all that he asked was, will you stay faithful too? And there is that term in there, in one of the passages, I love it because it's such a Southern term. It said that God reckoned with Abraham. Reckon meaning that he had accepted everything that Abraham had done. It was kind of like his offering was his action. That was the offering that he brought before God. And so that he says, even when you're uncertain, can you stay faithful? And so the thing was, he was obedient. He wasn't always trustful, but he was obedient, like in the story of Hagar and Ishmael. But then with the story of Isaac, we see this growth. He was obedient and he was trustful, that God was going to provide the sacrifice. He didn't understand it at the moment, but he was going to live into the trust that this is what's going to happen. And so as I think about us, I think about really how the plan gets done, meaning we're so concerned because we really want God to just outline, and we're just going to step this stone pathway to God, so because we don't want to make a mistake, do we? We don't want to, you don't want to make a mistake because there might be trouble associated with the mistake. And that's really what we're asking for, is God, fix my life so that there's no troubles in it. Well, God doesn't do that, And so the fact is, wherever we go on this path, It's not so important the journey, but are we obedient in the path? Do we try to live our life step by step in the way that we feel like God is calling us to lead it? And then we will ultimately learn that the covenant made with Abraham would not die with Abraham, because what he said is that you were blessed to be a blessing. And so the message for us is, are we going to continue on and be that blessed to be a blessing, that he was. And so I just want to, as sage people, that's the way of saying we're older, except for Jane. So, but we've got this life experience. And have you ever had an experience where you wondered, is this where I'm supposed to be? And then looking back, you think, yeah, I'm exactly where I was meant to be at that time. Have you ever had that experience? Or any that you'd like to share?
I guess for me, when I retired, I was like, I know you got to keep busy doing something. I'm going to be with you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I guess for me, the Wesley House has been kind of an answer to a segue to just being with children. If I'm not with children, I'm happy. I'm happy with David.
Well, I'm sure
Well, he's
it's
just a big kid, so that's why.
all right.
But I think retirement, I think you have to figure out, you've paid your dues kind of, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
What's going to make you happy?
Well, sometimes when you're doing the right thing and making the right decisions, because they're changed and they're different, you will sometimes wonder about that. And I know my own leaving home, quitting my job and leaving home and going to seminary when I had a daughter entering high school made me question my own sanity, at moments. But now I look back and I can go, well, that's exactly what I was supposed to do. But it just kind of went against every fiber of my controlled being at the moment because it didn't make any sense. But even in just the everyday, and I'll just share last Monday, I was getting my daily update from my sister-in-law, how my brother had done in the night. And she called and said, they're going to have to put him on a vent. And she was torn up. And I just, we've been wondering, we couldn't go there because we can't get in to see him. What was the point? And she not had her kids come in. And so and I said, well, we're just coming. And so we went. And Saturday night when I went to bed and my brother was stable, or Monday night when I went to bed, my brother was stable, I told my husband, I said, I don't know where I'm supposed to be. It doesn't feel right to be at home. It doesn't feel right to be here. I don't know where I'm supposed to be. I feel lost. And the next day passed. And I knew that Monday night I was exactly where I needed to be. I needed to be there, but I didn't know it at the time. And sometimes we just have to act and quit thinking about it so much. And I think sometimes that's where we get hung up in our plans, is we keep wanting this assured step of what's next. And when all God says is just take the step, because I'm going to be with you no matter where the step is. Even if it's a misstep, I'm still going to be with you. And I think that that's the harder part, because we want everything nice and explained before us. But it doesn't work that way. And what the ancient story of Abraham, like I said, our human character is still the same. We don't want to mess up. And we want to know exactly what the future holds. So we say, and yet I will say, I don't really want to know because it takes away from today, doesn't it? When we think too much about what the future may hold. And so God just says one step at a time. You can't handle it all right now. Just take one step at a time. Don't rush it. Just, kind of take one step. And it's okay if you go, I just don't know about this. And believe me, if it's not the right step, that'll be made clear too. but what the thing is if you made the misstep, you gotta let it go. It's just like, I love to watch college basketball. And I think sometimes players go into a cold streak because they're spending way too much thinking about the shot they missed than thinking about the shot that they can make ahead. And and sometimes we do that. And so you miss opportunities. So any other thoughts, any other lessons that you gleaned from Abraham?
And thinking about my calling and changing to missions, and now we've got the youth ministry open again. Somebody said, well, are you going to go back and do youth again? I'm like, no, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. We're doing lots and lots of missions, and I want the students to do well and not to have this turnover. But, look at how many people we're serving and how many people are serving. And I'm doing what I'm called to do, but I'm not supposed to go backwards and to do student ministries again. We've got to find the person that's supposed to be doing that. But that's not for me to go back to pick up again. That's not the calling now. So,
You're
it is proof of that changing calling. What was an emphasis, and it's still, in both cases you were serving, but different areas of service have evolved over time. And I think that's what you were saying, Nancy's, I fully believe that teaching is a calling, it's a ministry. And for you needed to do that in a different way, but you didn't, so it's just the change, so I think that is very true. And what skill set you have, God will continue to use in the next, whatever that calling looks like. It was part of that too.
But I think for the generation now, I think it's really hard for kids. I look at our own kids and other kids that have grown up, and they may not be in the most lucrative area, but yet the bottom line is just like I say, if you're happy, it's okay to do something that is not, quote, lucrative or whatever. And
Well, I'll say this, there are a lot of rich people who are not happy. So to your case in point. And there are a lot of poor people who are quite content. So, or what one might consider poor. So that's not to say, well, the poor people are happy, just leave them alone. I don't mean that. Yeah, you know what I mean. So.
Well, it's like the old saying, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day the rest of your life.
Yeah. It's true. Well, I hope you've learned something from Abraham. But before we close, I want to share with you the blessing, and then we'll close with prayer. But this is from Saint Teresa of Avila, and it kind of speaks to Abraham's story and to our story. And like I said, I'll include this with the handout that I send out. May today there be peace within. May you trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities born of faith. May you use those gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. May you be content knowing you are a child of God. Let His presence settle into your bones and allow your soul the freedom to sing, dance, praise, and love. It is there for each and every one of us.
Wonderful.
I love that, and thought that was a great message that we might take out of that. So like I said, that will come out with your notes with the video here. But anyway, let's just close with the word of prayer, if you will. Almighty God, we thank you for Father Abraham. It's hard to imagine living in that time and culture, and yet we don't need to imagine that. We just need to remember that just as we are fearful of moving and doing and staying assured and obedient, so was Father Abraham. It's a human characteristic where we want to trust ourselves sometimes more than we trust you, that we want to have the way forward made known so that we can somehow prepare ourselves for it. And yet, oh God, we you know that we can't handle all of that at once. And so what you've asked us to is to remain obedient, that we might live out our calling that Jesus laid forth to us in his life. What does it look like to follow you? That we might serve others, that we might show compassion and generosity, and that we might pour out that love of life and others that he poured out. And if we can do all of that, God, then I believe you will say of us, as you said of Abram, that we have reckoned with you. We've been reconciled unto you. And God, that is what we most desire, is to live a life that is pleasing unto you. And it is in that pleasing that we lift before you the names of those who have been mentioned in need of prayer, the families that are continuing to suffer through COVID and all the long-lasting effects of that. We pray, oh God, for the medical teams that are just exhausted and full of so much despair and their inability to change situations. We pray for families, oh God, that have been impacted by that. We also pray, oh God, for our nation, for we have declared ourselves to be one nation under God. We have forgotten who you are and what it is that you call us to do. So God, may we become people, though we may not be on the national news at night, but wherever we may find ourselves, may we be people who speak the word of truth as Christ spoke it. May we live lives that truly do model what Jesus would have done, no matter what the circumstance. So I thank you for our time together. I thank you for each of these blessed people gathered on the screen. And then I ask that you hold all within your hand as we continue to go forward with the same obedience and faithfulness as shown by Father Abraham. Amen. Well, thank you, friends. And next week we'll be doing Hannah's story. So we'll see what you think about that. So in the meantime, I'll send out the video this afternoon, and call me or text me if you have questions. But I love each of you. Until we meet again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenna.
Aye.
Thank you, Glenna.
My pleasure.
Thank you.